Today we're going to talk about niche and some other interactions between organisms that an ecologist would study. A niche is the range of physical and biological conditions in which a species lives and the way the species obtains what it needs to survive and reproduce. Simply put, an organism's niche describes the environment where it lives and how it interacts with the environment. In this one statement, though, we describe a lot about an organism and a lot about its interactions. And if you remember the definition of ecology, it is studying interactions between organisms. One thing you have to understand about an organism's niche is think about the range at which it's capable of living. And that range is called tolerance, or the ability to survive and reproduce under a range of environmental circumstances. If we take a look at this image down here, you'll notice that in the middle we have an optimum range. This is where a large percentage of the organisms will be able to survive. In an optimum range, just about any species in the world will do just fine. Often, though, organisms end up living in a different range besides that optimal range. It's a little outside the optimal, and so what we find is that it's a little hard to live there. And you can see at the bottom that the population is a little bit smaller, and we see it on the other side of this range. And why there's two different sizes is quite simple. If we think about this as temperature along the axis, over here being high temperature, over here being low temperature, most organisms will like to be in moderate temperature. Humans are that way, for example. We like the mid 80s to low 80s, and that's a really comfortable temperature for us. But if we start getting into the 90s, 95 every day, 100 even every day, those start to really put a strain on humans. We rely on air conditioning and our technology to help us survive, but without it, dehydration would be a major problem. The other end is an example as well. If every day it's freezing cold, we have to rely on, again, our technology for heat, clothing to keep us warm. It's not quite as optimal as the optimal range. It's not as good. And so organisms really like to be in that optimal range, but they always can't be there. And sometimes they quite end up in a zone of no tolerance, and that they can't tolerate at all. And you'll notice there's no population over here, and there's no population over here. That would be the example of, the temperatures were 120 degrees every day. Well, humans would not be able to survive that very well. And the opposite is true. If every day we ended up being negative 40 degrees, well, humans wouldn't survive very well. So that would be outside of our optimal range. Key examples of things that are often found in a tolerance range are things such as salinity, or the amount of salt that water has. Humans like fresh water. That's what we drink. We need it inside of our body. And of course, we can swim in salt water, but ingesting it is not good. Other organisms are the same way. Many plants require fresh water and will not survive well with salt water. Other plants, however, have an optimal range needing salt water. Other things that stand at tolerance are things like acidity, your pH. Certain organisms don't do well at low pHs or acidic environments. However, the bacteria in your stomach, because it's very acidic, would be just fine in an acidic environment. They would not do well in a basic environment, which is a high pH. There are a lot of different things that you could tolerate as an organism, but your ability to survive under these environmental circumstances is your tolerance. Another key component of the niche is the resource that an organisms need. Of course, the term resource can refer to any necessity of life, such as water, nutrients, light, food, or space. And oftentimes, we say organisms live where they compete best for these resources. We'll talk a little bit more about compete in a moment, but let's think about this cactus here. This particular cactus lives in the desert, a very, very dry environment. It's able to survive there not because that's its optimal range, because it can outcompete everything else there. If we think about a cactus, what is it good at? Storing water, not losing that precious commodity, that resource. A cactus will grow here in Indiana just fine. The problem is it gets outcompeted. Other organisms grow better here. Notice that this cactus can gather all the nutrients it needs, and it does so best in its own niche, or that specific way that it lives and where it lives and how it interacts. There are some physical aspects to a niche as well. We talked about resources there, but sometimes an organism needs a specific set of environmental components for its survival. This North American frog is an example of that. All amphibians require water. They very readily will have water pass right through their skin, and so they need a damp environment. As well, frog's egg requires liquid. And so the frog will lay it in the water where it can germinate, become a tadpole. The tadpole will live its entire little cycle inside the water, and eventually it will mature into a frog. These amphibians must have water. And so that's a physical aspect of their niche. It's not alive, but it has to be there for that organism to survive. If we took away the water, we'd be destroying the frog's niche, and without that, the frog would not survive. There are biological aspects to the niche. These aspects involve biotic factors that require for survival, such as when and how it reproduces. This particular wasp is an example of that. It will capture a tarantula, it will sting it so that it's unconscious, and it will lay its egg in that tarantula, trying its best to avoid the vital organs so it can bury this tarantula and that the tarantula actually stay alive for a while that larva develops. When the larva finally develops, it then uses the tarantula as a source of food until it is finally an adult, and then it can leave the tarantula. This tarantula is a biotic aspect of this wasp niche. If the wasp could not find an organism such as the tarantula to lay its egg in, that egg would not survive, thus the wasp would not survive. It's a biological or living necessity to the niche or the way that this organism lives. Without it, the organism would not be alive. Some situations they will excel, like the cactus or the toad or this wasp, but in others they will not excel. It's because of competition that niches form. Organisms are going to survive where they compete best. Of course, competition happens because of resources, food, mates, and places to live and raise your young. What I have here is a picture of a lion that has just made a kill. This lion wants to eat that kill. It worked very hard to catch it, but it's tired. It took a lot of energy to kill and drag down this animal. But what has happened with this lion? What's happened is that these hyenas have showed up. They also are interested in eating that kill. They're looking for an opportunity to get that food without working at it. At the same sense that these hyenas and this lion are competing for that food, if other lions were here, this lion would have to compete with those other lions for food. Competition happens between individuals of the same species, and it happens between individuals of different species. So long as those organisms want the same resource, in this case the meat of this animal, they will compete for it. And that competition is very important because most often the competitor that loses dies. And if they die, they're not able to reproduce, they then don't pass on their genes, and that becomes a problem for the population. We also talk about this competitive exclusion principle. Direct competition between different species almost always produces a winner and a loser, and the losing species dies out. Competitive exclusion principle states that no two species can occupy the exact same niche in the exact same habitat at the exact same time. They're in the same place at the same time, trying to use the same thing, and they will compete themselves until there's a winner and a loser. If we think about some species like the lion, in their area they're competing for that food. But they do it in a different way than hyenas. They do it in a different way than cheetahs. They compete differently because if they competed in the exact same way, in the exact same place, for the exact same thing, they would fall under the example of this competitive exclusion principle. One of them would be a winner, one would be a loser, and they will die out. So what we see is that organisms will split up a resource and compete for it in different ways. Here's an example of the competitive exclusion principle. These are two different strains of paramecium. The dotted line is when they were grown all on their own, and you can see that line right here. Blue was grown all on its own in optimal conditions. Notice that its population went up. It has this very characteristic S-shaped curve that we'll talk about later, and it survived just fine. The red dotted line is when it was grown all on its own. Notice, it has a very similar S-shaped curve. Its population did get a little bit higher, but notice it still leveled out and grew just fine. That was when they were grown separate. The solid lines are when these two paramecium were grown in the same location, using the same resources at the same time. According to the competitive exclusion principle, this means one must live and one must die. If we take a look at this graph, notice red was clearly the winner. The population goes up, ends up reaching about the same population size. But notice, the growth was slower. It took more time. It took more time to get to that peak. Right here, it took 10 days to get to the peak that it only took 7 days to get to before. So this particular paramecium was the winner. You know that because its population is still high and it continues going. If we look at the blue, it starts off doing very well. It's still competing, and then something happens. The competition goes south for this particular organism. Slowly by slowly, its population decreases until finally, in the end, its population dies out in day 14. Before, when it was on its own and was not required to compete, it was doing just fine. But once that competition is placed on it, it's in the same place at the same time for the same resources. The competitive exclusion principle will cause one of these individuals to die out. In this case, it's the blue paramecium. Earlier, I talked about dividing resources. These 3 warblers do that with one spruce tree. Notice that they have their colors. This one's a light blue, a yellow, and a green. The tree itself will be partitioned by these organisms. The Cape May warbler will fly at the top. It will use the spruce tree only at the top. The bay-breasted warbler will be at the middle, and the yellow-rumped warbler will be at the bottom. Notice that although they're using the same resource, the tree, they're using it in different locations at the same time. Remember, for the competitive exclusion principle to take place, we have to be using the same resource at the same time at the same location. These organisms have divided the resource. They use it in different locations. And because they've done that, you only see competition in the middle of the tree between bay-breasted warblers and other bay-breasted warblers. At the top of the tree, you will see Cape May warblers and only Cape May warblers in competition. This ensures that the species continue. Besides competitions for resources, there are predator-prey relationships, an interaction in which one animal, the predator, captures and feeds on another animal, the prey. This is called predation. We're going to talk about an example of a lynx and a snowshoe hare. Here you see the lynx catching a snowshoe hare. It's going to have a great dinner. If we look at their populations, you'll see very, very clear patterns in what happens to them over time. I want to highlight a couple things for you. These are numbers in thousands over here for population. So if we're at 40, that's 40,000, 60, 60,000, etc., etc. Time is on the x-axis. You see we start around 1845 and we end almost a century later in 1935. There's a lot of data in this particular graph. You'll notice the legend. Hares are represented by a solid line and lynx are represented by a dotted line. If we look at their initial population, the lynx were higher than the hare. And if you watch as time goes on, the lynx population gets higher and higher. But notice that when the lynx population is high, the hare population is low. Think about this. The lynx needs the hare for food. If there are not very many hares for food, some of the lynx will go hungry. And so the lynx has a problem. As their population gets too large, it then can't be supported by a small population of hare, so it crashes. And so from about the 1950 mark, we start to see it bottom out, but in between 1945 and 1950, we see a decline. You see that decline right here. That's important because as it declines, notice what happens to the hare population. Its predator goes down, therefore the hare's population skyrockets. It's up high in the 80,000 mark by 1850-ish. And so when their population is really high, all of a sudden these few lynx that are left are readily able to have food. If they have food, they can survive, reproduce, and they have offspring. And so we see a jump in their population. Around 1855, their population has rebounded. Notice the corresponding reaction in the hare population. As the lynx population jumps, the hare population falls. This is that predator-prey relationship. We see it time and time again. Over here, we see hare population really high, and while it is really high, the lynx population is growing. As the lynx population grows, the hare population will start to drop. When the hare population is at its bottom, you see the lynx population high. This oscillation will happen over and over again as the two populations keep themselves in check, because the lynx needs the hare for food, and it must have a sufficient amount of hare population to support itself. If the lynx's population gets too high, there's just simply not enough food from the hares, and so they have this direct predator-prey relationship. We see this in a lot of different organisms, but the lynx hare is just a phenomenal example of it.